August 1945, somewhere in the English countryside, 10 men sat trapped in a beautiful lie. They lived in a comfortable country house called Farm Hall, treated well, given books and food, allowed to walk the grounds. But they were prisoners, and they didn't know the most important secret of all. Every single word they spoke was being recorded. Hidden microphones had been installed in every room, in the walls, under tables, even in the gardens where they took their evening walks. British intelligence officers sat in a nearby room with headphones, writing down everything these men said, every argument, every joke, every whispered confession. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. These were some of the greatest scientific minds Germany had produced, the men who understood the deepest secrets of the atom, the physicists and chemists who had spent years trying to unlock the most destructive force nature had ever concealed. Werner Heisenberg was among them, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, a man whose name would be remembered for centuries. Otto Hahn sat with him, the chemist who had discovered nuclear fission back in 1938, the man whose breakthrough had opened Pandora's box and made everything that followed possible. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Max von Laue, Walther Gerlach. These were men who had stood at the frontiers of human knowledge, who had peered into the heart of matter itself and seen possibilities that terrified and thrilled them in equal measure. The British had captured them in the final chaotic weeks of the war, rounded them up from laboratories and universities across Germany, and brought them here to this pleasant prison in the English countryside. The question the Allies desperately needed answered was simple but profound. How close had Germany come to building an atomic bomb? Had Hitler nearly possessed a weapon that could have changed everything, that could have turned defeat into victory, that could have held the entire world hostage? The generals and scientists talked freely because they believed they were alone, because they trusted each other, because they had no idea that their captors were listening to every single syllable. They discussed physics and politics. They argued about who was to blame for Germany's defeat. They wondered what would happen to them now that the war was over. Some worried they would be executed, as were criminals. Others hoped they might be allowed to return to their families, to rebuild their lives, to continue their research in a world that had been shattered beyond recognition. Then came August 6, 1945, and everything changed in an instant. A British officer walked into the common room where several of the scientists had gathered after dinner. His face was serious, his voice careful and measured. He had an announcement to make. Something extraordinary had happened, something that would reshape the future of warfare and humanity itself. The Americans had dropped a new type of bomb on Japan, he told them. A single bomb, one weapon, had destroyed an entire city called Hiroshima. Tens of thousands of people had died in a flash of light and heat, and the city had essentially ceased to exist. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then someone laughed, a short, nervous sound that broke the silence. It had to be propaganda, didn't it? Allied psychological warfare, an exaggeration meant to break Japanese morale or perhaps to frighten the German prisoners into cooperating. They had heard wild claims throughout the war, stories that turned out to be nothing but fabrications and lies. Heisenberg shook his head slowly, his expression skeptical. One bomb destroying an entire city? Impossible. The physics didn't work that way. You would need tons of explosives, massive formations of aircraft, sustained bombing campaigns. They had seen the devastation the Allies could inflict. They knew what 1,000 bombers could do to a German city, but one bomb? That made no sense at all. The British officer insisted it was true. This wasn't a conventional weapon, he explained. This bomb had used atomic energy, nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms to release unimaginable power. The same science these German scientists had spent years studying, the same theories they had explored in their laboratories, had been turned into a weapon of almost incomprehensible destructive force. The laughter died instantly. The room went utterly silent. You could hear breathing, the creak of chairs, the distant sound of birds outside the window. One by one, the scientists began to understand. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't propaganda. This was real. The Americans had actually done it. They had built the bomb, the theoretical weapon that had haunted the dreams and nightmares of physicists for years, and they had used it. If this was true, it meant something almost too painful to contemplate. It meant that Germany had lost a race they hadn't even fully realized they were running. Hours crawled by after that announcement. The scientists gathered in small groups, their voices low and urgent, trying to process what they had just learned. Otto Hahn sat alone in a corner, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly. He was the man who had discovered nuclear fission, whose experiments in Berlin 7 years earlier had revealed that uranium atoms could be split, releasing tremendous energy. He had published his findings, shared them with the scientific world, never imagining where that knowledge would lead. Now he understood with crushing clarity what his discovery had enabled. The hidden microphones captured his voice, quiet and devastated. He felt personally responsible for this, he said. Hundreds of thousands of people dead because of work he had done, because of knowledge he had uncovered. The weight of it was unbearable. He talked, in whispered tones, about ending his own life, about how he couldn't live with what his science had created. The other scientists tried to comfort him, to tell him this wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known, that science itself was neutral and only its applications could be judged. But Hahn couldn't accept their consolations. The blood was on his hands, he believed, and nothing could wash it away. Then the conversation shifted to an even more painful question, one that would haunt these men for the rest of their lives. Why hadn't Germany built the bomb first? They had the scientific knowledge, some of the greatest minds in physics and chemistry. They had started their research early, back in 1939 when the war was just beginning. They had understood the theoretical possibilities, had conducted experiments, had built primitive reactors, and explored isotope separation. So what had gone wrong? Where had they failed? The recordings captured their debate, and it revealed the truth about Germany's nuclear program, a truth that was simultaneously tragic and perhaps, in a dark way, fortunate. Germany had indeed pursued atomic weapons. They called their effort the Uranverein, the Uranium Club, a collection of scientists working across the country on the problem of harnessing nuclear fission for military purposes. Heisenberg himself had led much of the research. They had built experimental reactors. They had tried to figure out how to produce enough enriched uranium or plutonium. They had wrestled with the immense technical challenges involved. But the program had never received the resources it needed. Hitler and his generals had been focused on quick victories, on tanks and aircraft and rockets that could be deployed immediately. The V-2 rocket program had consumed enormous resources because it promised results in months, not years. An atomic bomb was theoretical, uncertain, impossibly expensive. The military leadership didn't believe it could be done in time to affect the war's outcome, and they were probably right. Funding dried up. Scientists were reassigned to other projects. Laboratories were closed or repurposed. By 1942, the German atomic program had essentially stalled, reduced to small-scale research that would never produce a weapon. Now these scientists sat in their English prison, learning that America had succeeded where they had failed, and they had to confront the magnitude of their defeat. Heisenberg stood at a chalkboard that night, chalk in hand, surrounded by his colleagues. They needed to understand how the Americans had done it. The microphones recorded everything as they worked through the physics, arguing, calculating, revising their assumptions. How much uranium would you need? Heisenberg asked, scribbling equations. How would you enrich it to get enough of the fissile isotope? How would you trigger the explosion? How would you contain the reaction long enough for it to build to devastating levels? They debated through the night, filling the chalkboard with mathematics and diagrams. Some argued you would need tons of uranium. Others thought perhaps only kilograms if you could enrich it sufficiently. They worked through the calculations, slowly piecing together a picture of what must have happened. The Americans must have used uranium-235, the rare isotope that made up less than 1% of natural uranium, or perhaps plutonium, an artificial element that didn't even exist in nature. Either way, it would have required massive industrial facilities, factories operating in secret, thousands of workers, technological capabilities on a scale that seemed almost impossible. And Germany had never known it was happening. That was perhaps the most shocking realization of all. While Germany's program had withered and died, America had built an entire hidden industry. The Manhattan Project, though they didn't know its name yet, had employed over 130,000 people and cost more than $2 billion. Entire cities had been constructed in secret in the American desert and mountains. The scale of the effort was beyond anything Germany could have achieved, especially while fighting a war on multiple fronts, while being bombed into rubble, while running out of resources and fuel and hope. Then the conversation took a darker turn, moved away from physics and engineering toward moral questions that had no easy answers. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. Perhaps it was fortunate that Germany hadn't succeeded, he suggested quietly. The others turned to stare at him. What could he possibly mean? Weizsäcker's meaning became clear as he continued. If Germany had built the bomb first, Hitler would have used it without hesitation. There would have been no debate, no moral questioning, no restraint whatsoever. Cities would have been erased from existence. London, Moscow, perhaps New York if German bombers could have reached that far. Millions would have died, not in conventional warfare but in nuclear fire, and the world would have been plunged into a darkness even more terrible than what they had already experienced. The room fell silent again. Every man there knew it was true. Hitler wouldn't have dropped one bomb as a demonstration or warning. He would have dropped every bomb they could produce, as quickly as they could produce them, on any target he could reach. The moral calculus would have been simple in his mind: total destruction of his enemies by any means available. Some of the scientists tried to defend themselves, to create distance between their work and its implications. They were just scientists, they protested. They had been following orders, pursuing knowledge, doing their jobs. They hadn't made political decisions. They weren't responsible for how their work might have been used. But the recordings tell a different story, capture a different truth in the pauses and hesitations in their voices. These men had known exactly what they were building. They had understood the power they were trying to unleash. And somewhere deep inside, some part of them was relieved that they had failed, grateful that this terrible weapon had not been placed in Hitler's hands. Days passed at Farm Hall. More news trickled in from the outside world. A second atomic bomb had been dropped, this time on a city called Nagasaki. The devastation was just as complete, just as horrifying. Japan was preparing to surrender. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally ending. And these German scientists understood their place in history now, understood what they had lost. They had been defeated in the most important race of the 20th century, perhaps the most important race in human history. Not a race for territory or resources, not even a race for military supremacy in any conventional sense, but a race for ultimate power, for a weapon that would dominate warfare and politics for generations to come. The atomic bomb changed everything. The nation that built it first would shape the post-war world, would hold a sword over the heads of every other country on Earth. America had won that race. Germany had lost it. The recordings captured their final conversations, preserved their voices for history. Some talked about what had gone wrong with Germany's program, dissecting their failures. Poor leadership, they said. Bad decisions by people who didn't understand the science. Lack of resources and industrial capacity. The chaos of war making sustained research impossible. Others talked about fate and fortune, about whether perhaps the world was safer because Germany had failed. Maybe we were meant to lose, one scientist mused. Maybe some higher power had intervened to prevent an even greater catastrophe. But one question haunted them above all others, echoed through their discussions again and again. Could Germany have actually built the bomb if circumstances had been different? If Hitler had provided more support, if the military had believed in the project, if resources had been allocated differently, could they have succeeded? The truth, which historians would piece together in the decades that followed, was stark. Germany had never been truly close. Their program had been years behind the American effort, lacking the industrial capacity, the resources, the singular focused commitment that the Manhattan Project represented. America had built entire secret cities, had mobilized the best scientific minds from multiple countries, had poured vast wealth into solving every technical challenge. Germany, fighting a losing war, bombed and blockaded, could never have matched that effort. But sitting in Farm Hall in August 1945, the German scientists didn't know this yet. They believed they had been close, believed that different decisions might have changed everything. The microphones captured their regret and confusion, their shock and their complicated sense of relief. These recordings remained classified for nearly 50 years, finally released to the public in 1992. They showed the world something important, something that still resonates today. They captured the moment when the men who had tried to build Hitler's atomic bomb learned that they had lost the race, learned that someone else had crossed the finish line first and unleashed a power that would reshape human civilization. Their words, preserved on those old tapes, remind us of the terrible responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge, of the choices that echo across generations, of the moments when history pivots on decisions made in laboratories and government offices. The atomic bomb didn't just end World War II. It started something new, an arms race that continues today, a world where the power to destroy entire civilizations sits in silos and submarines, ready to be unleashed. The German general's reaction to Hiroshima revealed their shock, their guilt, their complicated emotions about their failure. They had come so close to building the ultimate weapon, or so they believed, and they had been beaten to the finish line. The impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still echoes through our world, shapes our politics and fears, reminds us of what human beings are capable of creating and destroying. Those recordings from Farm Hall capture a unique moment in history, when brilliant minds confronted the consequences of their work, when scientists faced the terrible implications of their science, when men who had sought power found themselves grateful that they had failed to achieve it. The race for the atomic bomb shaped our modern world in ways we're still discovering, still trying to understand. And the voices of those German scientists, captured in secret so many years ago, still have something to teach us about responsibility, about knowledge, about the choices we make when we pursue power without fully understanding where that pursuit leads.